Thank you. Thank you for wonderful introduction. That's a lot to live up to. And thank you, of course, to all of you for coming this evening. Congratulations to the graduating student who just became an architect about an hour ago in this room, I believe. So lots is going on here today. And thank you, of course, to Liliana for the invitation. It's slightly weird being described as the new English now, this week. I'm not proud. In fact, my apologies. It's a bloody mess. One which I have to admit I don't fully understand. I think nobody in London fully understands. It's something from elsewhere, and that is not the subject of this evening. I suppose the subject of this evening is perhaps to say that while our little island is behaving in an unbelievably stupid way at the moment, it hasn't always been so. And this is a story kind of about modernity and how modernity transformed landscape into public space. And I'm starting with this fella. He's called John Plampin. It is a painting by Thomas Gainsborough, who was one of the great portrait and landscape painters of the 18th century, very influenced by French painting. And it could be typical of a mid-18th century condition. So, first of all, it's a man. That's important. It's a man leaning comfortably against an oak tree. The oak tree, a kind of symbol of kind of permanence and the kind of the natural order of the landscape. It's a very wealthy man, and essentially he is sitting here lying against his oak tree, looking at, well, with a landscape behind him which belongs to him. So essentially, in the mid-18th century, the landscape is essentially an aristocratic commodity, and is the landscape painting of the time, particularly Gainsborough, but maybe also Constable, somehow recorded a certain, that condition. And that painting is hanging here on the left. So it's from 1751. In front of it, there's a contemporary artwork by a British African artist called Yonke Shonabara, which is also based on the French landscape painting or portrait of aristocrats in the landscape, but just after the French Revolution, which is why they're missing their heads. And this is the first room in an exhibition called The Lie of the Land, which is the opening exhibition of the new MK Gallery, the new Milton Keynes Gallery in the UK. This is the first room, looking out towards the town square outside, and then turning around, there is just one great big axis that runs, it's about 100 meters long, absolutely dead straight, forming a sequence of rooms along an axis, a sequence of gallery rooms. And these are, you could say, the spatial arrangement is a direct reflection of the town in which it belongs, which is Milton Keynes, which is a 1960s new town, a very radical social and utopian project from the kind of the reconstruction after the war. And this is one of many drawings by the German architectural illustrator Helmut Jacobi, who in the kind of conception of this town was instrumental in communicating it through drawings. So this is an image of the shopping center, which you'll see more of later, which is a kind of arcade, like a public space arcade that runs 750 meters long along the main axis of the town, which is a grid city laid over the Buckinghamshire landscape, about 50 kilometers north of London. It is a bit of typical English landscape, probably quite like the Gainsborough painting. And then in 1967, through a government act, they came along and they slapped a grid city over it, a kind of a new Americana, a new utopian Americana. And this white building along the central axis is that shopping center. So everything on grid, everything on axis. And as you walk through this axis, there's a little painting on the right there, You can see there two different views of a kind of idea of public space, one from the 70s, but this one also from the mid 18th century is by Canaletto, and it's called The Grand Walk from the Vauxhall Gardens, Vauxhall Pleasure Gardens. And this is absolutely simultaneous with the other aristocratic idea of landscape. And it's the first representation of public space. There was an emerging middle class coming out of the kind of industrial wealth of the 18th century, and they started to have time and money to spend in public. And this pavilion on the right is the first landscape pavilion dedicated to playing music in public. So it's not part of an aristocratic landscape. It is the kind of beginnings of public space. Of course, you had to have the money, you had to have nice clothes, and you had to behave at least openly. You had to be well behaved. And then if we continue, we go into the second room. The second room of the exhibition, which is about this kind of story of landscape, is about inclusion and exclusion. It's about protest in the landscape. It's about who was excluded and who was included. And in it, on the left-hand side here, there is a plan of a garden. There's the plan of Stowe. Stowe is one of the three great sort of English landscape gardens, and it's only about 15 kilometers from Milton Keynes, and is very important to the city. Essentially, it's a great big drawing by Sarah Bridgman, but really this is the bit that we're interested in. It is a garden. Now it's a school, but it's a house with a huge garden. And it was the first garden that was open to the public, in which that plan that you just saw actually also existed about this size in a guidebook. And the garden was designed to be visited by the public. So you could go out because you had this new free time, you had this new kind of industrial wealth, and then you would arrive here. And then the guidebook would tell you that you could take two routes. If you went left, the house is up there. If you went left, you had a fairly short journey to the house, and that was known as the path of vice. It was easy, it was quick, but essentially it was for people of relatively low moral standing. If you have higher moral standing, you would take the route to the right. And then you would go through a whole series of landscape structures, open and closed spaces. It would take you through a kind of allegorical story of the kind of the politics of the day, and then you would eventually arrive at the house. And so in the path of vice, you arrive, you go through, you get these views through kind of constructed kind of bridges that aren't actually bridges, they're just there to frame the view. And then there would be a whole series of little pavilions. So these two photographs are sort of to and fro. So everything would be mapped through these little, either little temples or grottos or obelisks. Here, there is one of the larger cupolas. It's actually a golf course now, which is very weird. And then in the other side, you would go through a much more kind of complicated array. This is called the Temple of British Worthies, and it had busts of people like Shakespeare, various kings and queens, and the sort of the people that were considered in the 18th century to be the kind of the foundation of a non-monarchist a political system. So it's actually a political garden. It's a garden which is essentially challenging the authority of the monarchy through kind of picturesque means, like this one. But maybe the most important structure in this garden is the line at the bottom. This fairly kind of inoffensive line that goes across the boundary is in fact a structure that is known as a ha-ha. A ha-ha is a ditch that is cut on one side and the land on the other rises gently, and it stops animals and the things you don't want from coming into the garden on this side, but from the garden side it appears like it goes on forever. And so this is the view from the house across the ha-ha, you can see it, but then from further away it appears like your land goes on forever. It's a kind of optical device to make you feel like you own the whole landscape. In fact, the ha-ha is between the two pavilions. That's a ha-ha in Rousham, which is another garden nearby. And the ha-ha is a very important kind of idea about the garden being a kind of boundless space, one that takes you from where you are, from your point of view, to infinity. And I would argue that the ha-ha is essentially the first plate glass window of modernism, that thing that all of modernism has done to try and blur the boundary between inside and outside starts here in the ha-ha. It's a kind of invisible horizon. And you get it, for example, in places like the Barcelona pavilion, or the German pavilion in Barcelona by Mies van der Rohe. Stowe was copied throughout the 19th century as a kind of template for picturesque gardens, particularly in Germany, in the kind of the Romantic period. And so the kind of at least the idea of Stowe would have been well known by Mies. And of course then he takes it at a more epic level to America with the Riesel House in the 30s. But before we get there, just like to kind of just reflect a little bit on the garden. And the garden, or the constructed landscape, has always been the most direct and clear expression of our, humankind's, relationship to nature. It's a microcosm of the world, and for architecture to exist outside of it, as it has done for a couple of centuries, is to rob it of its purpose and meaning. So what is a garden? A garden, initially, is an enclosure. This is the walled garden in Rousham. So all of these gardens start with a small walled garden, because in the kind of mythology of the garden, outside the wall, there was all the beasts, there was all the danger. Outside of the garden, the wilderness was hostile and violent, hardship and danger. Whereas inside the garden, all was in harmony. And that's a kind of motif that kind of ran through both kind of landscape painting, landscape design, and also in urban planning. So for example, you have the Boboli Gardens in Florence that were the template for the rebuilding of the City of London in the late 17th century by Christopher Wren. It never happened for other reasons, but nevertheless, this idea of the kind of garden structure as a kind of paradigm for architecture has run all the way through our kind of modernity into things like the garden city movement, where the garden city is actually not really about the garden, it's about the ownership of land, or the co-ownership of land. It's often mistaken. Actually, this is a political instrument rather than a horticultural one. And then, of course, it continues into our time, and occasionally I think we get very confused by what a garden is. I just wanted to go back to this origin, and the walled garden is essentially based on the kind of parable. There are lots of different versions of this for different faiths, but the Christian one is that paradise is a walled garden. In fact, I think that paradise is a Persian word which basically means a kind of enclosure around. Adam and Eve were there. They ate from the tree of knowledge, and then they were excluded as the kind of, here they are, eating from the tree of knowledge, and then they get excluded. But nevertheless, the type remains. And the type with the two rivers crossing, the fountain in the middle, becomes a kind of absolutely central structure for European landscape and architecture, and in this case, the medieval cloister. The medieval cloister develops out of the Middle Ages and through the Renaissance, and then into the kind of early modernity. So this is a kind of mixed picture historically, and it's actually Cambridge. So Cambridge University, the courts, the colleges, are essentially the kind of monastic order just brought forward, and then they become a kind of typology that is right into our times. And on the left is from the late 1950s, early 60s, Churchill College, which then replays the same theme after the war, more or less simultaneously with Milton Keynes. It's an example of kind of, you could say, picturesque brutalism. It's called brutalism, but it's not very brutal, it's very genteel. And it's essentially a landscape structure of courts. courts, usually with a specimen tree, with student rooms around them, and then you'll see in the center of it is the kind of dining hall and the archive, the Churchill archive, but you can see all the courtyards. And by the late 50s, early 60s, they, of course, were quite anti-clerical, anti-religious, and the chapel is actually up there. So by then, obviously, the kind of social structures had changed enormously. And we made a building here, a new court. For a long time, it was called New Court. But rather than the court excluding the wilderness, because we're in an open landscape setting, in fact, it has it within the court. So our project was essentially a doppelganger, a kind of copy of the 1950s plan type, but then reorganized, exactly the same dimensions, but then reorganized for all the bedrooms to face outwards, all the common spaces to face inwards, and to make a kind of new sort of wild garden and kind of public space. It is a square, but with a very, very slight curvature on the facades, somehow reflecting or acknowledging the kind of the wide open landscape setting. And then it's remade in kind of 3 layers, so 3 layers of the original college in brick and concrete, 3 layers with the cut that you mentioned, which is sort of part of a kind of traditional timber frame technique of overhanging the thing. So that's the former structure, which is based around staircases. Of course, you can't do that now anymore because of accessibility. So we only have 2 with lifts. But ours, rather than it being concrete and brick, is made entirely out of timber. So it's a timber frame, all kind of sort of designed digitally and then assembled very quickly on site, but always referring back to actually like copies of the original concrete structure, which in fact is a kind of memory of a timber structure in the first place. So it's this idea that materials, the language in architecture and its materials keep on flipping over each other, but often one cycle out of step with one another. So in fact, that may be closer to the original than that. And to do the building in timber, in wood, rather than in concrete, we thought was almost making the mineral become organic. But of course, when you actually start looking at the timber, you realize that the timber is actually very like the concrete, because the concrete also bears the imprint of the timber that made it. So maybe these oppositions are not quite so clear. In this case, we used oak from railway freight trains, the bed of freight trains, which we found in France. They were from the early part of the 20th century. We're not exactly sure of the origins. And then we found 8,000 square meters of it in France. And essentially the college, madly, 3 years I think before we were building it, they just bought the whole lot. And then that became the kind of husk, the kind of outside of this building. So you get the rough old oak, and then on the inside of the court, it's then cut like cutting through a fruit or something, kind of really fresh oak. And then, like all bits of English nature, it's never natural, and it's actually comes in on a crane and is planted. It comes from above, not from below. But that is kind of a kind of truth to all constructed landscapes, especially the ones that look natural. And here is the court, just after it was built, with the kind of birch trees starting to grow. Now they're starting to fill the space out. And then you can see the various kind of entries to the upper sections, which then have tiny bits of concrete emerging every now and then. So it's never quite true. So it's 99.9% timber, and there's one steel beam in it, and then a few concrete ones. But the concrete ones are essentially the same proportion as the timber, so they appear a bit like scar tissue. And then this is one of the bedrooms overlooking, I mean, it's a completely English setting. There's cricket fields, lawn tennis, and so on. And this is the building essentially set within a kind of landscape context. Everything, these are the trees that were planted when the college was first built, which are now 60 years old. And then this kind of wonderful copper beech tree, which then becomes one of the landmarks, as well as a kind of a willow, which was dying, was cut back, and now is coming back again. And then this is on the day that actually we were here with Fernando, doing some photography. Occasionally in autumn, the building and the kind of landscape that surrounds it turns into exactly the same color. And that project, which is essentially, I would call it a landscape project, a garden project, was first rehearsed in a sense. The prototype was this little house in East London, which is for Lizzie Troop, who had MS and couldn't live vertically anymore because of her wheelchair, but nevertheless wanted to be part of her family and part of the garden that she loved. And she said, you can do whatever you like as long as you don't touch my mulberry tree. So we had to bend the house around the tree in order to get then the length so that she could go down the ramp. The whole house is on the slope, and then it takes you down to the end. Everything is built out of timber, including the foundations, and then takes you down to the garden. And then in the end, it's a little bit like being within a walled garden. So it's a sort of that kind of typology of these sorts of little bits of kind of wilderness, little bits of paradise inside the enclosure. And she had said, it's a very low budget project. When we were doing it, she had said that she had seen a project we had done, or my students had done in Zurich for a pavilion, designed and built in 2 weeks in Zurich, just outside the School of Architecture is there on the right. And it was a little structure to host a lecture and a party with a budget of 0 and 2 weeks to do it, to host 60 people. I won't go into the details of it, but essentially it's all reclaimed materials with a kind of order to how they get distributed according to their frequency. And their frequency, the amount of each material, determines how much it gets open and closed. So a very simple structure called 96 hands. There were 48 students doing it. And then everything, including all the offcuts, were used to make the structure. They were only allowed to use hammers and nails and hand tools in order to keep it safe, but also to make it available for everybody to participate in. And one of the students found in a manual of timber construction this pattern of how to knock multiple nails into one joint. And if you put them in a circle, it means that they misalign on the grain and they prevent the timber from cracking, from splitting, which is a kind of rather beautiful kind of accommodation of the natural properties of the material and a kind of little bits of expression. Many years later, we did another such project, a slightly more sophisticated one, this time in Peru, in Lima. It was a collaboration between our students and the Catholic University, the Católica in Lima, and they got together in order to build a structure in an archaeological site called Pachacamac. This is them last summer. Trying to first make the architecture out of their own bodies, to try and also make it, it's also a kind of courtyard project in one of the strangest contexts I've ever seen. It's an enormous archaeological site, but it appears like a desert. And it's right beside an industrial port that exports cement and imports oil. There is the Temple of the Sun. These are the studies that the students made at the beginning of a kind of mapping exercise before building. And then other types of walls, I suppose much less kind of evocative than the kind of the paradise walls. This is between the kind of public land and then the polo fields next to it. And then they made these drawings, probably difficult for you to see at the back, but essentially these line drawings plotting the condition of boundary and threshold, or the city around it. So at the top, you have the informal part of the city pressing down onto the site. There's this huge open area which is being very slowly kind of excavated, there are these groups of people who come in once a week to clean it, because of course contemporary waste contaminates the archaeology. And then these are sort of drawings which are about the materiality, the esteras, as it's called, which is the woven cane screens. And when they come and make a new settlement, they start overnight by making a very small esteras kind of tent structure, which then 24 hours later becomes a sort of little frame structure. And then on the bottom right, you can see then it gradually grows and grows and grows and becomes part of the structured, highly structured, but nevertheless informal settlement. These settlements are sitting on top of these structures, which is one of the burial grounds, which is, let's say, what makes it an important sacred site, where you get these burial structures, which are essentially then wrapped in multiple layers of different kinds of textiles. So the textiles from a kind of symbolic and kind of decorative sense, all the way through to a very kind of pragmatic sense, as just the most, the quickest and most expedient type of structure. And that was the beginnings of some of the materiality of this project, which was essentially a space where archaeologists could explore their finds in public. One of the ways to stop all these neighbors by pressing in and taking over the archaeological site was to make them know that it's an archaeological site. And therefore this structure is really about a kind of shady space where they can bring the finds, and then when they've sorted them, when they've cleaned them a little bit, they get stored in these two ends, the two ends as storage, and then they get, in the background there is the archaeological museum if they are very valuable things. So it's another kind of courtyard structure, but this time a kind of open one, which is really about how it absorbs the outside of it. It was built in 3 weeks by 35 students, and then kind of has this sort of rather kind of mysterious sort of presence in this sort of dusty, sandy landscape, which occasionally kind of produces the most incredible artifacts. This is a 1940s reconstruction of a convent. But you'll see here, I think, some of the conditions of this landscape. You can see how abrupt the end of the city and then this kind of desert landscape starts. It's incredibly close and visceral and quite sort of energetic. Then you've got the super wealth on one side, the polo players and things like that. Then you've got the cement works, which is another order of things altogether. It's still a sacred site, even though it's an archaeological site, and that's one of our students, who's actually a Peruvian student from ETH, and we had to make, not quite daily, but kind of weekly offerings to the gods below and the gods above in order to kind of honor the site if you're going to interfere with it, if you're going to somehow place something on it or in it. And at the end of every day, you have to clear the site of every little bit of nail or screw or debris so as not to contaminate the ground below it. It's kind of related, I suppose, spatially at least, with another project which we're doing now, which is, let's say, post all those pavilions. It's actually a garden in ETH. This is the back of ETH campus. And we were given a rather kind of not very elegant enclosure. Again, not so much paradise, I think, here. But one in which we are able to make a garden as part of our studio, and every single cycle of students actually adds a layer to it, while also having to take care of everything that happened before them. So it's about making new things alongside the kind of the maintenance and care for previous things. And I think that that as a kind of metaphor for how architects should behave now is a kind of interesting one. So they spend a few days every semester. This is the first season where they planted a kind of ellipse of fruit trees. And then every semester there's a kind of new layer is added upon it. This is the first, the decontamination of the ground. Then the building of a landscape pavilion, a little bit like the one in the Canaletto, a kind of performance pavilion, which is this one in white timber, which had been an exhibition for Peter Merkley when he left the school. And we got all the kind of timber from it. Again, trees don't come from below, they come from above. And then more recently, this is last autumn, a structure known as a gumna, which is a Balkan structure, which are these round structures in the landscape for people to meet and talk. They're normally made of stone. Here it's made out of kind of a very kind of rough, sort of tamped concrete, and then has become, next to the sort of performance one, a kind of meeting space for the campus. Of course, in Switzerland, winter really takes everything and covers it in white. Spring comes along again, probably about this time of year, maybe a little bit later on in April, it will start growing again, and then in autumn, it all starts decaying again. So that cycle of kind of growth and decay becomes sort of structured within the garden. But of course, that idea of decay is not just nature and plants, it also is a natural path for architecture. And this is a photograph from Forst, a town on the Polish-German border, which is one of the studies we did. So we do these sort of building works or gardening works, and then these huge urban studies. This is a photograph, which is this place, exactly the same. In the 1930s, until the 1930s, it was the second biggest textile city in Germany. That's what it is now. And it's a kind of condition, maybe a kind of extreme version of a European condition of a kind of post-industrial nature. This is another of the archive photographs that they found, and then went back and took the same photograph. You notice the bench with the three girls sitting there, the tree, and the bridge. The bridge is still there. Weirdly, the bench is, but nothing else, or something else has happened. For that to happen in Western Europe is quite amazing. So the students ended up making a survey, kind of drawings of every single part of the city, whether all its buildings, as much of its landscape, even things like the natural history, every plant that colonizes a pile of rubble, and then tries to find in that some sort of vector for the future, some kind of maybe retrofit garden city. There's one of the collages they made of the typical East German Plattenbau, but then reset within this kind of landscape setting. And this is one of the two remaining textile mills. There used to be 400 of these things in this town, 400 of them. And now, essentially, it's kind of ruins coming out of the forest. And perhaps that is an image of architecture that's been with us for a very long time. The myth of the garden and a providing nature as the source of the fictional origins of architecture in nature, under the watchful eye of a goddess. But of course, not all of landscape, nature, architecture has been in the service of, you could say, pleasure or leisure. Actually, its origins or its early incarnations are also scientific. The botanical gardens in Padua, which I think are the oldest ones still in their original location. And these much more structured gardens then kind of grow into the Renaissance garden in Italy, which then develops a kind of even bigger domination of nature through geometry, through horticulture, and architecture. And then you could say it kind of grows and becomes the Mannerist gardens, the Baroque gardens, and then at its most epic, you get Versailles by Le Nôtre, the absolute monarchist. There is a vector that goes straight from God right into that room over there, and then it shoots its aura across the axis. It's the divine will of Louis XIV, with a kind of, you could say, the divine king, the chosen one, on earth at its most kind of spectacular, at its most beautiful. And by the end of the 17th century, certainly in England, something really radical happens, is a bunch of people, including this guy, Isaac Newton, but also Leibniz in Germany, Descartes, start questioning the idea of a kind of divine providence and say, actually, science, the new sciences are kind of completely implicated in a kind of natural order of things which is beyond the capabilities of men, and a new idea of landscape as a kind of in its natural state emerges, particularly in landscape painting in France, like Claude Lorrain, or Claude as he's better known, and that becomes the template, essentially the political template of a kind of anti-monarchist English garden tradition, where everything is supposed to be coming out of nature. So this is Stauhead, Claude's painting of Aeneas and Delos. The guy who had this garden owned that painting. So they were really explicitly kind of retaking this idea of an Arcadian picturesque from people like Claude especially, but others too, and then making huge gardens. They would move villages to make them. These were incredibly powerful people who were aristocratic, but also made money from the new industries. This is a little scene from Barry Lyndon, from Stanley Kubrick's Barry Lyndon, where you realize that the people who occupy these landscapes are in fact completely decadent aristocrats and actually are a long way away from the kind of purity that they assign these landscapes. But anyway, Claude had an enormous influence on these landscapes, not least in the making of a Claude glass. Everybody wanted a bit of Claude, and his paintings were generally covered in a kind of golden aura. And people would walk around the landscape with a dark mirror in their hands, and then they would place them so as to see their landscape as if it was a Claude painting. For example, Sophia Anne Delaval, here in the kind of late 18th century, these things became very fashionable. So this is a Claude glass that distinguished ladies and gentlemen would carry around them, which perhaps are in fact incredibly close to the Claude glass that we all carry with us today. So as I said, so these gardens, which are all made in this kind of this kind of idealized nature, also contain things like the ruins, contain all the kind of archetypes of that ideal. And right here in the far corner, if you take the path of virtue, you end up at the Temple of Friendship, which is in fact not a temple at all. It's just a facade, it's a ruin, and the ruin is a kind of architecture at its most perfect balance with nature. And I suppose that is the idea behind this next project that we did in London, which is a studio for a photographer. This is actually the existing site. It's pretty ruinous, maybe not as picturesque as Stowe. And then the project is really about how you kind of grow out of that ruinous structure, both architecture and landscape. It's for a photographer called Jürgen Teller, who's a portrait artist, a portrait photographer. This is his daughter, in a pond, or this is the artist David Hockney, also kind of in a kind of garden. And Jürgen never takes photographs of his subjects in a kind of white screen. It's always situated. So the situation is more important than the kind of purity of studio, even especially when he takes self-portraits. This is one of his, I think on his 50th birthday. The building is in West London. It's on a long, thin site. It's about 65 meters long and 7 meters wide, and is essentially a series of building, garden, building, garden, building, garden, as if the whole thing had grown out of a ruin. It's a little bit based around John Soane's house, who was one of the kind of turn of the century, 18th, 19th century architects, possibly the most important English architect, I think, in architect's consciousness. And this is his house, which is all about light coming in from above, daylight coming in from above, but into these chambers where there are no views out, except through the pictures and artifacts that are on the wall. And essentially our project is like a stretched version of the Soane house. It goes from street to backs, so basically from public to private, a kind of post-production, archive, studio, meeting, kitchen, library, etc. And the gardens go from hard and then can start cracking and become more and more wild and naturalistic. And essentially the project is sort of about these kind of gardens which are sort of pushing their way through the architecture. These are some of the kind of early gardens of the project. He used the place as a studio even before the building was made. So while it was a construction site, he was shooting his subjects there. And then the project starts growing out of these walls. We had to keep some of the boundary walls, some of them, while most of the previous buildings were demolished. And then you still get these kind of moments where this sort of quite sort of visceral, quite sort of sloppy encounter between the new building and these fragments, almost kind of archaeological. We kept these bits of structure when they suited us, almost like little, in that kind of picturesque sense of having kind of fragments of architecture that forms one of the gardens, the first garden. No view out, but you can see that there is a little bit of the rest of the world poking up in the satellite over the top. And then this man having his photograph taken, trying to join, you could say, a kind of some sort of global space, but with a plate. And goodness me, what a long way we've come from who owns what landscape and what access do we have to it. Of course, as I said before, trees always come in from the air. Jürgen shooting, very, very physical process, that of planting. And then the beginnings of these gardens that start then a year or two, or a year and a half later, becoming so dense that you can't even see through them. So we're going to go through from front to back as a little sort of journey through. On the street, there is one window to the street, one front door, and then one little house for an electric car. When you come in, there's a view that runs all the way through. You can drive a van through it. It's just big enough for a van, with then a shaft of light to take you upstairs. A double-height studio for post-production, bookmaking, and so on, administration. And everything is structured by these beams above your head, and all the light comes in from above, filtered by these beams. And then back down on the ground, into the first garden, there's Charlotte Rampling, having her picture taken with a kind of feral fox. Looking through, so everything is about looking through one space into another, a bit like that, those kind of picturesque gardens, which are a kind of journey. Into the main space, the main studio, the main double height space, where in this case I think it's just after a shoot or just before, I can't remember. Sometimes wild shoots of 100 people, sometimes just one portrait. This is Andreas, I think he's Vivienne Westwood's husband. And then it kind of turns back into a kind of technical space and so on. Occasionally, these two characters never seem to kind of be far away. And they came back for a shoot completely coincidentally, but what they didn't get were the beasts that accompany the scene. So then they did bring them in. That's a carpenter who made the door, who was worried that the donkey was going to kick and damage the architecture. And then for another sort of self-portrait of the kind of, in this kind of situation of the studio. There are a few little notes of warmth. Everything is concrete and block work with a little bit of brass. And then in the back garden, there's a kind of reconciliation between Charlotte and the fox. In this garden, which started off pretty raw, pretty kind of empty, and then grows and grows until you really can't see through it. But then it becomes almost like a kind of grotto looking out onto this kind of micro garden. And then the final garden there, where more or less you can't even move in it because it's been sort of taken over by these plants. And that's even a year and a half ago. It's even worse now. And you could say that it is like one of these landscape structures where essentially nature is being framed by fragments of architecture rather than architecture being an object within it. And maybe takes us back to Stowe, to the way in which the architecture, that's the little ruin that I took the first photograph from, or perhaps the most archetypal of these spaces, which is the grotto. There is no good landscape garden without a grotto, and the grotto was seen to be the original museum. So the grotto was meant to be a space that was full of strange minerals, and Alexander Pope had the original grotto, that then he placed shells and minerals and crystals all around it, and it was supposed to be a kind of shimmering subterranean museum. And some critics have described the back of the German pavilion in Barcelona as a kind of grotto, as a kind of museum of minerals. And to some extent, that onyx maybe plays quite a similar role in that structure, particularly sort of setting a kind of new horizon in it through the bookmarking. So maybe you could say these two structures, the grotto and the ha-ha, are maybe the origins, or some of the origins, of a kind of mythical modern. And this map, in fact, is not entirely made up, because this is in the making of Milton Keynes, the city. Derek Walker, who was the chief architect, made this spread of references. He never explained them, they were never labeled, but they were the sort of the roadmap for making this city for 500,000 people. And of course, on it, you have the map of Stowe, you have the Barcelona pavilion, you have Vitruvian Man, Le Modulo, you have bits of Palladio, you have bits of nature, you have Tivoli, Buckminster Fuller, the arcades in Milan. But I suppose one of the kind of key structures, let's say pairing with Stowe, would be the Barcelona pavilion, which, as I said before, this is a very early plan. This is not the final plan. This is one of the first published ones. And in fact, in the final one, there was one sculpture in what I just call the grotto on the right-hand side. In the first ones, there were 3. And the water was actually sort of more central. And it was, you could say, it was composed more like a picturesque garden. You went from kind of structure to structure, from sculpture to sculpture, each one revealing a kind of new view. And maybe that's why I've always kind of projected this as a kind of ha-ha. This view out over the axis in Barcelona is a kind of proto-garden. But perhaps it's the column that becomes one of the sort of key elements in terms of that picturesque garden. In this case, this great cruciform column that you could call, I don't know, it's almost like the most famous drawing of construction to describe modernity is this, the four angles and then their cover in stainless steel. And that is more or less the only bit that Mies took with him when he went to America. In the 30s, he started designing a house called the Riesel House for a family. It's actually in Wyoming for a family in New York. It was never built, but actually all he's done is taken a picture of the surrounding landscape, this kind of epic American landscape, like nothing we've ever seen in Europe, and then places these columns, these sort of incredibly important landscape structures in front of it and kind of goes, there lies your architecture. But so the story goes that he then took a trip in Chicago to a steel factory and was so impressed by all the sections of kind of industrial I-section steel that was coming out of the factory that he suddenly had a kind of epiphany and realized that that little column would not do the job on the American landscape. It might work for the European landscape, but when he builds the Farnsworth House in the late 40s, actually the structure is on the outside of the building, importantly, and it has no capitals, it has no cup, it's almost like it's a kind of an infinite extrusion that will kind of go on forever. And that building was also on the kind of the map of references and is very similar in detailing to the wonderful shopping building that I showed at the beginning in Milton Keynes, even when you look down at the details. The travertine floor, the I-section that comes out of it, and of course in Mies's case, once you take the Farnsworth House, you stack it up a few times and you get the Miesian American city. So to some extent, this idea of the column coming out of a kind of landscape understanding then becomes the modern American city, the I-section plus the grid of the American landscape. Of course, the grid had been in the American psyche long before. In the early 18th century, one of the first colonial towns was a grid town called Savannah in the south. By the early 19th century, they are building grid buildings. So the balloon frame from about the 1830s onwards starts having this kind of march of the grid being both the construction method as well as the kind of the spatial abstraction. And this is the drawing, the ordnance survey that Thomas Jefferson, the president, made for dividing up the west of the Mississippi. So this is a kind of a drawing a little bit like the Garden City one about how do you divide up this enormous uncharted land into farmsteads, into private property without losing a kind of overall conception of what America was. Of course, Thomas Jefferson was one of the key visitors to Stowe and had stayed there and had been there with other kind of political leaders of his time. And essentially that drawing becomes the structuring device for everything west of the Mississippi. And perhaps it's no accident that in the 50s, Mies does the convention hall with the great grid ceiling over the kind of mass of people, and then floats the American flag over it. I tested this. This is 1954. Jasper Johns, the great American pop artist, conceptual artist, did his first matte painting in 1955. So I think that makes Mies maybe the first pop artist. Debatable. But anyway, if you take a Jasper Johns painting of the American flag, particularly the monochromes, you realize that essentially the flag is like an abstraction of the American landscape. So much so that when it's no accident that the Americans, when they had sort of finished conquering all the land available to them, would be the first to conquer space and set out that particular map. So the kind of the grid, the map, the kind of endless column becomes a sort of more than a kind of design strategy, becomes a kind of almost psychological space where interiors and the wider landscape start kind of mirroring one another. And that is where the strangeness of the kind of utopian view of Milton Keynes come from. These architects in the late 60s went to America. Some of them had worked for Mies. They came back with a kind of socialist utopian project to make this new city, and just came back with this kind of spatial and technical equipment, which is why they did that, which is about as un-English as you can possibly get. Except when you look at the pictures inside, where you realize that inside it is not corporate America. Inside it is, in fact, a whole new leisure class. This was supposed to be a new, better life for the people who'd been displaced by the war, particularly out of London. It was going to be young families, and there you can see a nice chap with a kind of smoking his pipe in the wave pool. The future is good, with all the vegetation growing over the trusses. And at the end of the city, they made this place called Campbell Park, which is a kind of late modern, slightly psychedelic version of Stowe. It's full of these sort of strange orbits and mounds and sort of slightly druidy, slightly picturesque. It's a kind of combination of things. And that sits at the head of this city. Our building is right there. It's the last building on the grid on the main axis. And I'm going to take you from the railway station, which is at one end of the axis, and then we're going to come around this way. You get off a train, the first thing that you have is these two portholes, and then the railway station with just totally gridded station square, right in the middle, a clock, almost like marking a kind of celestial time. And then the shopping building that just runs like this for 750 meters. The bus station, you couldn't get more Miesian. And in fact, in this picture, it's rather run down now, sadly, but you can see the kind of the desire path to be American. I mean, this is an incredible place. And it was all built from scratch. So there you have Lloyd's Court. That's the foundations of the shopping building. And one of the first drawings, they always objected to it being described as a garden city because they described it as a city coming out of the forest. This is the planting scheme for the trees. There are different species, but essentially it was meant to be a city that kind of emerged out of a forest. And the central bit is the pale one in kind of going diagonally upwards. The grid of the city is actually marked out by planting first, and then by roads. And then you get this incredible sort of overlay of a landscape structure with the kind of the landscape of mobility coming from America, the kind of highways. So then you get these very odd moments where infrastructure and landscape meet, or these kind of optical kind of games where sort of garden, woodland, town square all become sort of one strange place. And of course, as I said, it's got the ghost of Mies riding all over it. Occasionally, if you look carefully, you can see it. It's like a rainbow. And that is this kind of incredible shopping building, which was essentially Mies and the Crystal Palace. The Crystal Palace being seen as the kind of, again, one of the first big public interiors of the kind of consumer age. It's an absolutely incredible building, beautifully detailed. But at the end, just beyond it, suddenly you arrive here, and the whole idea of the city somehow loses its nerve. The structure of the city breaks. The grid is lost, kind of late 90s, loss of faith with, you could say, this kind of modernist idea. And you get these two buildings which are incredibly unremarkable, which are the Milton Keynes Art Gallery, and essentially we refurbished them and then built a building beside. But one of the other projects that we wanted to refer to is this one, which is called City Club. So Milton Keynes was started in 1967. It was being built progressively over the 70s. And then Margaret Thatcher opened the shopping building in 1979. So a complete change of ethos. Essentially, Milton Keynes, this is a completely social project. And Margaret Thatcher hated everything about it. She hated the fact that it was state funded. She hated the fact that it was about a kind of provision, a kind of paternalistic idea of the state. And she stopped everything, including City Club, which was meant to be this great cultural and leisure centre. And there's stadiums in it, there are pools, there were theatres, there were farmers markets way before they were trendy. There were community centres, there was art galleries, even a rodeo. I mean, again, they hadn't forgotten America. None of it is labelled, but they made these incredible drawings. Nobody knows what they actually refer to. They were just a kind of idea of this sort of utopian space of leisure. I mean, think of Cedric Price and the Fun Palace is in the back of their mind. And then this is one of the models, rather wonderful models, and weirdly, that piece looks incredibly like the project that we had already designed by then, but somehow we realized it fit into the city structure. So that is a kind of conceptual model of our project, which if you add it to Campbell Park and its kind of orbits, essentially forms the space for the project. And this is in the third room in that exhibition that I showed right at the beginning, and is a collaboration with two artists. On the right, Gareth Jones and Niels Norman. Niels Norman is an artist who specializes in play structures and playscapes and participatory art. And Gareth is a studio artist, a very pure studio artist, but he comes from Milton Keynes and he grew up in Milton Keynes. And somehow City Club was their invention as a way of adding another layer to the building. So the building is the grid meets the park. It's very simple, a grid with a circle in it. And from the park, and you look at it, you see the grid and the circle. Straightforward enough, in stainless steel, polished stainless steel, somehow a hymn to the kind of the tectonics of the city itself, the early high-tech architecture. But of course, that's not a true picture, because in between the park and the building is a motorway, which you could say is like a ha-ha, a kind of infrastructural ha-ha in between the two spaces. So that bridge in the top left there is that bridge. So there's a sort of, again, this kind of optical illusion that the city and the park are together when in fact they're divided. The other element that came into the project was the infrastructure pack. While they were designing the city, they were also exporting the city. There was this box, it's an A4 box, about that big, about 3 centimeters thick, or 4 centimeters thick, and in it, there is an instruction manual of how to build a modern city. So each card, so they had things like play structures in the shape of hands, or bus stops, or street lamps, or how to lay paving, how to do drainage. And the idea was that it was so amazing, they thought, that they would then be able to sell it to other places and they could also make the ideal city. Needless to say, have been no copies, but some pieces you do see around. The city was promoted through advertising. They needed to attract the kind of young families, young working class families to come and live there and get work there. So there's a huge campaign with these symbols, like the hand being a kind of very potent symbol of kind of humanity and sort of the gesture, the inclusion. And then we even found some bits of sort of modern archaeology, like this hand gate, which we brought back in, we had refurbished, and is part of the building now. And then one of Niels Norman's hand-shaped play structures, which is kind of out at the back of the building, and somehow sits in the city grid, maybe a little bit like, I always wondered what the little girl was doing in the middle of that endless monument, but perhaps she is just trying to find a little bit of space within this kind of infinite utopia. But of course, it's also the 60s, it's Beatles mania, early Bowie, and then there's this kind of pop cultural layer on top of it. And these are some of the signs that we did, which are actually copies of the original signs. So, you know, everything's kind of thumbs up, everything's good. And possibly the most important document as part of this City Club artwork is this, which is a page from the Habitat catalogue. Now, I don't know how many people here are old enough to remember Habitat. But Habitat was, let's say, before IKEA, when Terence Conran essentially brought modern design and a kind of aspirational idea of modern design to mass consumer culture, and made this catalogue where you could buy pre-packed furniture, and it was full of pages, including things like a colour chart, which here is from 1976, very much the Milton Keynes era. The left-hand side are the high-tech colours of the metropolis. This is metropolitan cool, if you're on that side. But of course, these metropolitan cool people were starting to go on holiday to Tuscany. And then you would get a pastoral idyll. So you get this sort of, they would come back with sort of earthenware and sun-dried tomatoes and things that you just didn't have in England. So it's like, this is again a map for a perfect life. There were photographs of interiors, these kind of high-tech interiors. And of course, our building is definitely a kind of hymn to the early high-tech architecture. You can see the little bits of red, the kind of crisp steel, and then all the colours are taken from the colour chart and have a very specific resonance. The other elements that we borrowed, the whole city is built around these porte cochères. Every 50 meters, there's a series of them to cross the boulevard, these kind of Mesian sort of memories, which then are perpendicular, you can see them in the background there, to the axes of trees. So everything is to do with this geometry. The plan of the building, the first two, in fact I'll go straight to this one. Those are the two existing buildings, our building. Essentially we redid the galleries so you get that axis, that kind of enfilade all the way through, and then added the kind of the box with the circle on the end. And there you can see that axis that goes from outside right the way through to the park. And we come back in, more or less, where we started, going through the axes, looking back the other way. So we're going through this journey of the kind of politics of landscape. In the third room, we have Elizabeth Frink here, but perhaps the more important one is that painting there, which is a painting of Milton Keynes by Boyden Evans called The Peacekeeper from 1983. And there you can see this is right in the middle of the peace movement of CND and anti-war, during the Cold War, of course. It's also kind of late punk. And then you can see this guy who's like, the background is this kind of grid. You have the street lamp, the setting sun reflected in the building, him looking down, rather sort of downhearted, and then with a little badge, I don't know if you can see it, but with the CND sign. So this kind of punk, who was often portrayed as a kind of aggressive figure, has a kind of pathos. And again, if you sort of somehow take these paintings and these situations and take them back to where they came from, how far he's come. He is looking at the floor. He owns nothing, this guy. His sense of entitlement over what the world is providing just couldn't be recognized from his ancestor a little while before. And then coming back round, there's the painting at the back there. And then in the final room, you've seen her, Sophie Delaval. So of course they're all involved. Of course they're all playing their tunes. And maybe our building could be seen as a kind of giant cloued glass. And then continuing round the journey, we're looking back out there through a Paolozzi kind of pop art sculpture, which is actually called the goddess Athena, I think, but for the kind of robotic age, is then the sort of the structure as you arrive from the park to the building. We come out of the galleries on the front of the building on the street side, and then we stop for a moment to see this chap. He's working on Milton Keynes in the early 70s in the design office, and this is an early work by Norman Foster, Not many people, he doesn't show it that often. And this is the office in which Milton Keynes was designed. It was full of landscape architects, product designers, social workers, sociologists, economists, and there were hundreds of them that were forming this thing. And it was being made in this room with its kind of red structure, black ceiling, and amazing yellow furniture. Of course, it rhymes a little with the Habitat catalogue. And then the other pictures in the Habitat catalogue of earthenware and a kind of rural idyll. So these two systems. And this is in fact the cafe now, which is in the middle of the building, which is sort of a kind of recreation of Milton Keynes' design office. So that you're sort of back in play with the kind of the red, the yellow, and the black, as a kind of reminder of where all this came from. So those steps then become cake stands, little details in the wood to cut round, and then you get lovely biscuits and cakes for the leisured classes on opening night 2 weeks ago. So there's the kind of, again, one of these sort of city club spaces, which then you go up, and even the lift is a city club space. The whole building is super cheap, so everything is done with sort of very basic kind of structure and materials and a lot of paint. And even the lights are so cheap that we decided to pair them so that you wouldn't even really look at them. And then that's a little homage to the railway station where you arrive. So the building essentially appears like a kind of landscape structure from one side. So from the park side, it is somehow behaving as if it's one of these temples or grottos in the landscape. As you go around the building, this is the entrance to the city by car. You get the red structure, yellow door, and the fire escape. The fire escape, which is actually wrapped around the red, we're still in the metropolitan colours. We go inside, so there's the pillar box red, going up inside, and then into the auditorium, where we suddenly switch into the landscape side. This is the side of the building that overlooks the park. And then it's the only part where you have, let's say, plywood, you have exposed timber structure, and then these sort of earthy, greeny colours. So that's the auditorium with its kind of great big window. Essentially, the composition on the inside is more or less the same as the composition on the outside with different materials. And this is Nielsen Gareth experimenting with curtains. And so now we are in the kind of ideal pastoral landscape, and then wrap the whole thing in a building in a kind of curtain, which is obviously from earth into plants into sky. And there's a detail of the room. It gets used for concerts, performances, cinema, lectures, and then you can wrap it up completely. And occasionally, you get members of the public, unlike Thomas Pamplin and Gainsborough, who turn up perfectly dressed. I was there last week, and she was just visiting, and I just thought, how amazing that people can look so great, especially compared with Gainsborough. And in the end, it's a kind of, it's a big public space, it's a big public interior, which comes, you could say, absolutely from that mid-18th century neighbour down the road, the grotto overlooking the landscape, the grotto overlooking the landscape. It's essentially an instrument to look at the landscape and to see how little has changed from Stowe in the 18th century to Milton Keynes in the 1960s, even when they were referring to prehistoric structures, Milton Keynes and Silbury, prehistoric mound, the orbits of Campbell Park and Avebury, again a prehistoric mound. They were very interested in kind of archaeology and druidism and so on. Many of the architects had worked for Alison and Peter Smithson, who were totally interested in druid structures like Stonehenge and stuff. This is a picture that one of the local residents sent me during the design process, when she saw that we had done this big circle, she said, "Oh, is it a CND sign?" Which I thought was a very kind of sweet and kind of romantic kind of reading of the project as still having that kind of utopian sort of idea of peace. And this is the building and the city, which in the end is not so far away from Derek Walker's original vision. It's never been acknowledged about whether they were in contact with the Italian avant-garde at the time, even though there is so much explicit kind of visual correspondence. And then from this, the continuous monument, which I showed before, it kind of, you could say, plays out in the building, especially at sunset, when the whole thing starts going kind of gold, or occasionally, as it was last week, or 3 weeks ago, going kind of pink or red. And as we go back round, this is the two original buildings that I showed at the beginning, which have the cafe in it and the entrance. You go downtown, and we're going to kind of end going back downtown. You can see the moon, but the neon lights, everything gets a bit more groovy as you go round, pointing to the entrance with the beating heart. The beating heart had been one of the first emblems for the city. When it was first published in 1974 in architectural design, it was a plan of the city with this neon heart. So there it is, the kind of original, the origins of the city in the landscape and the kind of the beating heart. And we look into that first building, back into where we started, and here we have Gainsborough. But maybe this time we shouldn't just be looking at Gainsborough, because since he painted that, since Milton Keynes was built, since the Industrial Revolution, since the Second World War, something else has happened in the landscape. And Jo Spence, amazing artist from the mid-80s, she worked on who is included and excluded from the spaces of leisure, particularly the outdoors, and to whom active and passive roles are assigned in relation to the landscape. Figures physically taking possession of the land and are constantly recurring motif across the ages. Representations of the figure of Spence in Spence's works share formal echoes with Gainsborough's portraits of land occupiers, but have more in common with acts of organized trespass and subversion, so instrumental in laying claim to public space and access to the countryside. In Remodeling Photo History, which is the name of that piece on the right, Spence presents the right to inhabit the landscape as inescapably tied to the right to inhabit non-ideal bodies. Between Gainsborough and space, we have remade the garden in search of nature, and we have reclaimed our bodies in search of public space. Thank you.